I have a great pleasure of announcing this next keynote. This topic is very near and dear to my heart as a journalist and as a developer. So this morning, I am beyond thrilled that Tom, Geoff, and Jackie have agreed to do this exploration and the intersection of data journalism, Python programming, and criminal justice reform. And of course, before I start setting them up on stage, I just want to do a quick content warning that the stories that they're going to be talking about deal with executions, murder, physical and sexual abuse of people in prisons, among other issues. If this is something you don't want to hear, that's okay. Please head out and see if there's anything outside to eat or do other fun things. So, the Marshall Project is a Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering the US criminal justice system. Through in-depth investigations and compelling storytelling, they shine a light on systematic injustices, amplify the voices of those affected by incarceration, and help shape the national dialogue on the reform. So I'm going to first bring up on stage Geoff Hing. Is a data reporter for the Marshall Project. He has worked as part of investigative data and news application teams in a number of newsrooms. He has covered demographic change in state and contributed data reporting to enterprise projects on water use and prison labor, analyzed police use of force data and records as part of a team investigating the efficiency of tasers, and helped analyze and visualize police accountability and shooting data. The next person I'd like to bring up is Tom Meagher, who is an investigative data journalist and senior editor at the Marshall Project. For over the past decade, Tom has used Python, Django, pandas, and other libraries for his reporting, including stories on long delays plaguing executions and how prison officers evade accountability for abusing incarcerated people in their custody. And last but not least, our lovely moderator for this morning, Dr. Jackie Cahill, who she is a Python software, a PSF fellow, former member of the board of directors, and a key leader in numerous open source community efforts, from scaling PyLeads globally to founding GeoDC, a hub for geospatial professionals in Washington, D.C. You may also know her as the author of Data Wrangling with Python and the creator of Mesa, the leading complexity modeling library in Python. So thank you to you three for agreeing to do this. It looks like you have a very engaged group. And let's get it started. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this early. I know I had a rough time waking up after yesterday's auction. Okay, so today we have Geoff Hing and Tom Meagher. Just to recap, Geoff is a data reporter at the Marshall Project, and Tom is a senior editor. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
So my title is actually very clear. Part of my time is spent as a reporter doing the things that you might imagine a reporter does, going to places where the US criminal justice system is happening, whether that's a courtroom or a park where police and city workers are clearing a homeless encampment, or a city council meeting deciding on budgets and policy actions or new laws and talking to people. And then the other half is the data part, where I am scouring public data portals, filing records requests for data that isn't publicly available, speaking with experts and researchers who have worked with that data, and finally writing Python code to uncover stories, turn documents into data, and find proof of some of the stories that we're hearing from people who are impacted by the criminal justice system.
And Tom?
As a senior editor at the Marshall Project, I work with our reporters who cover conditions in prisons and jails, and also the folks who write about the death penalty. So it's all pretty grim stuff. There's not a lot of uplifting stories, unfortunately. But I'm also a data journalist, and I work from time to time on stories of my own, very much in the way that Geoff was describing. I was going to talk for a minute about how I got here and built some of these skills. I mean, I have no formal training in computer science or math or statistics. I studied English and journalism in college. Thank you. My first job out of school was at a small daily newspaper in Kansas called the Lawrence Journal World. Thank you. Unfortunately for me, I was already gone a few years by the time that Adrian and Simon were there working on Django, so I missed out on that. I was the night cops reporter, which meant I worked in the evenings. I went into the police station and looked through a giant binder of printouts of all the crime reports of the day and all the people arrested in the jail to see if there's anything we should be writing about. So after that, a few years later, I discovered this organization called IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors. And that really started to open my eyes to what we could be doing with data as journalists and how it could be applicable to our jobs. I realized that I could start to, like Geoff was saying, look at the raw data itself from government operations to really understand what was happening. I didn't have to just trust what officials were telling me. I could pull the crime reports myself. I could look at the city payroll. I could look at the school board budget, and it would help me tell when the mayor or the school superintendent or the police chief were trying to spin me. And then through IRE, I started to hear about Python. There was a lot of excitement among journalists. I thought it was kind of out of reach for me initially. I will say I'm excited to be here for a lot of reasons, but among them is that Jackie, as our moderator, the very first time I learned Python in a hands-on workshop, Jackie taught it at IRE's NICAR conference in 2011. Yeah, thank you. And that's when it sort of opened my eyes. Not only was like this something that could be really, really powerful for my journalism, but it was also something that I could actually learn. This was accessible for me. And then a few years after that, I made it to PyCon in Montreal in 2014. And then just a few months later, I joined this new nonprofit startup called the Marshall Project to cover the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Tom. So just to clarify one thing, so Tom, you started in journalism and you learned CS. And Geoff, you started in CS and got into journalism.
Yeah, so I studied computer science and engineering as an undergrad, and I have always loved the program as long as I learned to do it, and was really excited to find a place that needed those skills that let me engage with the critical issues that my different communities I'm part of were facing and trying to make good decisions about, including the way the criminal justice system works in this country at large and in the individual places I was living.
So I'm going to go off script for a second. I hope I don't throw you all off. I wanted to ask the audience a quick question. Raise your hand if you formally studied CS. Okay, put your hand down. Now raise your hand if you didn't. Wow. That's amazing. That's awesome to see how many people who haven't studied. I really think it takes a balance.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see all the talks and the corners of the world that people, like the conceptual world, the tasks that people are using Python for to try to understand that world, whether it's water management, whether it's looking at the fairness of algorithms, whether it's looking at trends in electricity usage. Really, really, it's cool to see so many other people using code to try to understand the world.
So let's dig into a little bit more about the Marshall Project. What is the scope and project and mission of the Marshall Project? Tom?
Sure. So the Marshall Project was created, and our mission is to sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. As a little bit of background, although many of you have probably intuited this from just consuming the media, but for a long time, most newspapers and TV stations covering crime did it in a fairly simplistic way. You'd often get a report that a crime happened, you'd occasionally get a report that somebody was arrested, and sometimes you might get some coverage of the courts, and that was sort of the extent of it. But that simplistic reporting kind of led to very simplistic and sometimes misleading narratives, and they drove bad policies. And so the idea behind the Marshall Project was that we could tell more complex stories. We could bring some context to the conversation. There's a lot of interest, understandably, in innocent stories and wrongful convictions. We don't write a lot about that at the Marshall Project, to be honest. We're often looking at what happens when a crime has occurred, when somebody is guilty of committing a crime. How is the system operating? Is it operating the way it's intended to? What are the unintended consequences, and where is it falling short in terms of justice? So as part of that, we're looking at the system from start to finish, not just crime. We're looking at policing. We're looking at jails. We're looking at public defenders and prosecutors and judges, and what's happening in prisons, how they're operating, and what's happening to people when they get out of prison at the end of their sentence. So it's trying to have a much more holistic and contextual approach to have more complicated conversations about it.
And really quickly, I'll add that being a relatively young news organization, I think we've always been digitally centered, tried to use data and design to tell those important stories about a complex system, and also to make sure that people who are inside prisons and jails in the US have access to high quality journalism as well. And it's something that we've been able to do in part because of our relative youth.
Awesome, thank you. Can you share some of the projects that the Marshall Project has worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to talk about a couple of stories, although we've done a lot over the years. We've now been around for about 11 years, and many of them are data-driven and have used Python and other coding languages. When we first started, a lot of our initial stories were about the death penalty. Some high-profile cases, some more systemic coverage. But this one I'm going to talk about is one that I worked on for quite a while. As part of our mission to try to create a sense of urgency, one of our colleagues at the time, our managing editor, Gabriel Dance, had this idea. What if we were to create a very simple, interactive sort of widget tracking executions? How much time is there till the next execution? There's sort of nothing more urgent than the passing of time, especially when at the end of that, somebody's life could end. But there was not a really great data source for this. There were a couple of groups that were tracking cases at a very high level. But what we needed to know is at exactly what minute is an execution supposed to happen and where. And ideally, let's also find out some background about these cases. What are the natures of what's happening here? Since that didn't exist, we built a network ourselves of people to report on this. We created a group of what eventually became about 10 other news organizations, largely through contacts we made at IRE and NICAR to work with us. So in each news organization, they assigned a reporter or an editor to cover their state, and they were responsible for keeping track of the status of any number of cases where somebody was on death row and facing an execution date. They had to write a short story about it, and also update anytime the status changed. If there was some procedural update in the courts, if there was a stay, or if ultimately an execution happened. So to do that, I built an admin in Django that everybody could put their reporting into directly. It was really inspired by Chris Amico's project Homicide Watch in DC, and this idea at the time of structured journalism. I wanted the admin to sort of enforce the journalistic best habits. So every field in the form was really something that a good reporter was going to have in their notebook as they were covering this issue. And having the admin in Django allowed me to do a lot of automation. I could send automated Slack notices to colleagues. We could post things directly to Twitter. And I could also review things. So as our reporters and our partners were putting information in their reporting, I could edit it and review it. And once it's approved, it would kick off a series of automated tasks that baked out a bunch of JSON files to S3 that our front end that Gabriel built with D3 and WebGL, they could consume that and publish automatically. So the other story I'm going to talk about is a little bit different. This one was a collaboration with a couple of colleagues at the Marshall Project, Alicia Santo and Joe Neff. So about 5 years ago, we're coming up on the anniversary now, George Floyd was killed by police officers in Minneapolis. And after that, there was sort of a brief wave of reform. There was legislation happening all over the country to try to bring some new accountability to policing and other parts of the justice system. And as part of that, New York State repealed a law that had been on the books since the 1970s that made any information about suspected misconduct by law enforcement officials secret under law. It could not be accessed. New York repealed that law, so finally we could take a look at this. And Alicia recognized that not only did it apply to police officers, it also applied to correctional officers in prisons. So we could finally get an insight behind these walls and the barbed wire into what's really happening in our prisons. After several years of fighting and negotiating, we did get the data. We got about 5,600 cases of misconduct investigations, into employees of New York State's prisons. These ranged from absenteeism, tardiness, to things much more serious. Really sort of horrific accounts of physical abuse, sexual abuse. In some cases, in a lot of the cases, there was just accounts of lying, either lying to investigators or failing to document misconduct. We sort of narrowed down our focus onto about 290 of these cases where there was an accusation and the state tried to fire an employee that it was accusing of seriously physically abusing prisoners. What we found in our analysis that only about 1 in 10 cases did anyone end up getting fired in these investigations. Very often they were looked at and then discarded. So one thing I just want to point out about the visualization here, these series of illustrations, there's a real hazard with data journalism and visualization in general, that you sort of lose a sense of what the unit of measurement is, especially when you're aggregating it up with bar charts. You can kind of easily forget that we're talking about people, especially in criminal justice. Sort of every record is a person. Very often it's a crime victim, it's a police officer, it's somebody sentenced to prison. And we really want to keep, as a news organization, our focus on recognizing the humanity there. So we put this together, this inspired by Bruegel and Richard Scarry illustrations, although they also talked about it as sort of a Where's Waldo, but this attempt to sort of show the scale of the issue, but also keep the focus on every case in our database was about one correctional officer accused of abuse. And we really this was sort of the main element in a much longer text story that we ended up publishing with the New York Times.
Thank you. And Geoff, can you tell us a little bit about what is a news app and how does this relate to news apps?
Yeah, so I think a news application is usually a web-based application that's trying to give people a way to explore data about the news. And I think we've really seen in journalism, or at least the Marshall Project, a shift from something that's more like an app, so where you can monitor or get a social media update about someone who is set to be executed, to the second story that Tom talked about, which is really more of what I would call a data-driven investigation, where you're using an administrative data source to identify sources who are in the data, to be able to contextualize a particular anecdote or instance that you've heard about through other kinds of reporting, and to calculate statistics about the big picture. And so I think that we've really seen a shift from news apps, which are, take a lot of labor to maintain, and audience habits are changing, and towards these investigations that really rely on data, but are maybe rendered in a more visual or narrative form.
Thank you. And so let's talk a little bit about the journalistic process. How does a story begin, and when does a story become a data story? Do you want to start with the first part, Tom, and then?
Sure, I can talk about how it begins. There's sort of two main modes. One is we have a data set, let's plumb it and see if we can find something interesting. That can be a little tricky because very often the data sets that exist are created for something totally different than what we're looking for. It's intended to often keep a record of some bureaucratic or governmental function, but it's not really meant to ask the kinds of questions that we would want to know as journalists. So a lot of the times we're starting with the question and working back from there. In some cases, like our execution tracker, we end up having to create the data ourselves because it doesn't really exist. In the instance with the New York State prison misconduct, that data existed, but it wasn't intended to answer the kinds of questions we wanted. And in fact, when we went to New York's Department of Corrections with our questions, they're like, we don't really look at it that way. We were able to get some insights, but they weren't really using it in the way that we might.
And when does a story become a data story, Geoff?
I think that, so I'm a member of the data team, which is 4 reporters and 2 editors. And like I said, when I described my title, we are setting out to tell stories that convey the urgency of the US criminal justice system. And try to sort of stay in our lanes with our skills, but sometimes realize that there just isn't data about something that feels really urgent. And so the best way to tell it is through those conversations with people who are in those systems, impacted by those systems. Other times, sort of as I alluded to, you'll run into hearing about a story here, talking to one or two people about their experiences, and you really go out and want to prove how often this is happening, that the impact is larger than just a few really dire experiences. And so we will search for data. And all throughout that process, there are many challenges. As anyone who works with data, there are many challenges along that path. And so I think stories often maybe are anticipated as a data story and then become one that's more traditionally reported, or the data becomes critical as evidence of a dynamic that's happening, or something will be promising in the data and an analytic path just doesn't really work out, or it's not possible by the deadline when we need to publish the story. And so I would say the answer to that is stories are constantly weaving in and out of becoming data stories or becoming stories that are told or based on other kinds of reporting.
Thank you. So you have a story idea, you have data, then what?
Geoff, would you back up to the one before this? So I can talk a little bit about the sort of case study of this prison abuse story. And that was an instance where our colleagues saw the data would be available. She spent over a year arguing with this agency to get them to release the data, even though the law had changed. We had to get lawyers involved. Ultimately, this is what we got. Several hundred pages of heavily redacted, sort of weirdly redacted pictures of spreadsheets that we wanted to turn into some tabular data. So our process for this was sort of threefold. The first step was to try to take this and turn it into a data frame that we could analyze. So we used a Python library called Camelot to help us read in the data, and then we wanted to get something that would match the PDFs exactly, just to start. We started working in Jupyter Notebooks to do some exploration and to see how closely Camelot made it to the PDFs, but also to see the obvious errors in there. The second step in the process was to not just replicate the PDFs, but start to figure out what's wrong in it. And that required a lot of just regular shoe leather reporting, as we call it, although a lot of it was sending emails and phone calls, realizing that there were hundreds and hundreds of mistakes in the data. People's names were misspelled, they had the wrong job title. It was surprising. It was not always clear who an individual was. There was no unique identifier for each employee. You would often find that there are people with the same name when the same job title working at the same prison at the same time. And you wanted to be certain which one was the one accused of abusing a prisoner, which one was not involved. So we could see how many unique people were actually involved in these cases of misconduct. So that required us going back to the agency and asking them hundreds and hundreds of questions. And to their credit, they did answer them eventually. It took them a little bit of time, and I think they were kind of surprised that we were looking at it so closely. But we wanted to then clean up the data so that we could confidently do some analysis. That original Jupyter Notebook was great for exploration, but not really great for sharing with some colleagues who are less technical in the newsroom. It wasn't as great for sort of running it over and over again. So we then refactored all that into a set of scripts that we could run from a make file and that we could write some tests against. And so that then became sort of the backbone of our pipeline that would sort of take our data. Our ideal is to start with the original information we get from an agency and run one command on the terminal that can then run all of our processing and spit out the output that we could publish. But to get there, the last piece of it is that in addition to calling and sending emails and sort of asking people questions, we would have our colleagues in the newsroom review the data cleaning and analysis at every stage of it. So Geoff and others of our folks on our team, I think at various points 8 or 9 people were involved, would go through. I'd pull a sample of records from what we were processing and say, can you look at this? First of all, can you see, does it actually match what we were given originally? Did I pull it down correctly? But also, what are some of the editorial questions we need to ask? What are the things that jump out as you as peculiar or that might be noteworthy? And by getting a lot of eyes on it, we could sort of increase our confidence that we were accurately capturing what was happening with this data.
Thank you. So let's move into the life cycle of the story. So Geoff, what does maintenance look like for this?
So I think that maintenance at this point, where we're doing these more data-driven investigations, looks sort of different than maintaining a news app. And so at any given time, I have probably a half dozen ideas, little data tasks I'm exploring to move forward the data reporting in stories that I'm working on or that I'm working on with my colleagues. And so what that means is that often there will be a curiosity where it just doesn't pan out, or there's not a way to take a very rich data set and render it into something that's going to be resonant with the audience. And so this slide shows a repo that Tom made the last commit in many years ago that was used to do some sort of exploratory visualization to get at the size and scope of carceral systems in the US, which is the top map. When I was working with an amazing reporter, Susie Cagle, who's also an illustrator, on a story about a prison impacted by the changing climate in California, I once again became interested with the same, the same question of where prisons and jails are and how they are impacted by other systems that are, sort of happening spatially. And that was the impetus to sort of reboot working with the same data set. And I've been making commits to this repo kind of here and there over the course of this weekend. So a lot of it's less maintaining a single app or pipeline and more using code to pick away at ideas and sort of, when you take another crack at it, adopting more modern tooling and methods.
Thank you. And what does sunsetting an app look like? And what does that mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about a story, and in the case of our The Next to Die, our death penalty tracker, creating a whole system to start it, but we didn't really think beyond the launch of it that much. We're like, we have a group of people, we'll do this for some period of time, let's see how it works, and then make the decision. Next thing you know, it was about 5.5 years later, and it was still running, still on the same Django admin, which meant I had to learn a lot more about Django than I ever knew to keep it going all that time. But finally, we decided, it had been a very successful project in this respect, but we wanted to shift our focus of our death penalty coverage. So it's time to end it. How do you gracefully end something you've been doing in public for a long time? So we thought about this quite a bit. And what we realized is that in the course of gathering the information and writing about hundreds and hundreds of cases, we had created a data set that didn't exist anywhere else, and it could offer us some insights into how the death penalty was operating at that time. So we said, let's make a story out of it. Let's do some analysis of everything that we've collected in a way that we hadn't really been doing all along, as we'd been focusing on individuals' cases. And so we could say, okay, at that point we had tracked 120 executions. There were probably hundreds of other cases that came and went over that time. They were stayed or went back to the courts for various reasons. And we could see that there's this really important notion in capital punishment about finality. The whole idea is that there's going to be finally a resolution to these cases. But what was often happening is sort of the opposite. People would get execution dates, they would be pushed back and pushed back and pushed back multiple times. People would have, or they would have a date and they would sit there and they would wait. In some cases, we were seeing that people were waiting 16 hours before they were finally executed, which raises real questions about this idea of finality and sort of constitutional concerns about cruel and unusual punishment. So we were able to sort of publish this final story and then say, okay, we're now sort of freezing this app in amber. We'll leave it there for people to come to, and we can move our focus to somewhere else.
And I'll set this up for Tom for another consideration, is that maybe when you think you are done using a data set and you've published a story, it's not really the end. New news happens on that topic that sort of demands or offers an opportunity to return to data that you spent all this time processing and understanding and talking to people about and talking to the people whose stories are encoded in that data, to sort of look at the next beat of how a certain dynamic is playing out in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and in this case, we had published this story about 2 years ago on the prison abuses. And then, again, it came up in the news. In December, a man was beaten to death in a New York State prison. And it was very high profile because some of the officers involved thought their body cameras were off, but they were not. So it immediately sort of generated this storm of interest. And Joe and Alicia and I realized we had this body of data. We could go back and look at it for things we hadn't seen before. In this case, this man was beaten in a prison infirmary. Prison nurses were witnesses and sort of caught up in this case. We had never looked at nurses originally, but they were in the data along with the correctional officers. We could come back to it, and we ended up writing 3 more stories out of the same data this year.
Thank you. That's interesting. Let's talk about scaling from an engineering perspective and from a data perspective. So these data sets that we've talked about don't cover the complete United States. Why not build a project that goes across every state in the US, like every block?
So I think, this whole keynote, I've been talking about the US criminal justice system, when in reality, that is an incredibly distributed system. And in fact, maybe a more correct way to think about it is that it's thousands of systems that overlap and interact with each other. In one city, you may have campus police, you may have park rangers, you may have the county sheriff, you may have the local police department, you may have federal law enforcement, agencies, and that's just looking at the policing side of it, not to say anything about the different court systems and the different kinds of facilities where people are incarcerated. And so trying to get data at a national scale about all of those aspects when it is happening in this very granular and distributed way is incredibly difficult. And even with the full weight of the federal government behind it, for one aspect of that, looking at collecting crime stats from all those local policing agencies up to the national level, which is something that the FBI has been doing for decades, we can see as it's tried to modernize that system. This chart is part of the reporting that my colleague Weiwa Lee did, that shows that the adoption of these practices, how good a job local jurisdictions and states do at reporting that upstream to create a single consistent data set is really, really hard, even for the people whose explicit job it is to do that. And so trying to work around access issues as journalists can be quite difficult. So I think that we try to find data about places that is representative, and that makes sure that and to make sure that when we're talking about a place and we're talking about data about a place, we are contextualizing that. To underscore that, this is some Python code, a base class that I wrote to try to process arrest data for a story looking at kind of the differences between how often people are prosecuted and arrested for just carrying a firearm versus how often the same police departments are solving gun homicides. And, there's a consistent set of operations that you do, regardless of whether that data is coming from. You can standardize it, you can clean that data. What the Python code can't do is win that FOIA back and forth with an agency. It can't make up for the fact that a police department's record management system switched and they can no longer extract records with all the fields that you want more than 3 years in the past. And it can't make up for all the differences in local laws and state laws that may impact how something like an arrest is ends up being in a database. So, data journalism, I would say journalism in general is quantizing these very complicated systems. And we're constantly making choices, whether it's what source you include in a written story or which cities you're including in a data analysis, we're constantly making the call of sort of lowering the fidelity while still trying to be as accurate as possible about what's happening in lots of different communities, and letting people sort of have a lens to think about the criminal justice system where they are, even if we're talking about a place like Chicago or Phoenix.
Thank you. And so what are you working on now? What can we see from you all coming out soon?
Sure. I think like many of us, we're trying to make sense of what's happening in the world right now. Obviously, there's a lot of activity, particularly on the federal level. A few areas we're particularly keen on is trying to understand what policies are changing in response to the new administration. We're seeing a lot of activity around policing of reproductive rights, around immigration, not just on federal agencies, but that has a trickle-down effect. We see states and localities adopting some of the same, or attempting to adopt some of the same policies. We're seeing a lot of activities in the courts. So, you know, the Marshall Project, we're really trying to understand what's the practical effect, what does it mean for people who live in a lot of communities. Particularly, we have 3 local operations we've launched in the last few years in Cleveland, in Jackson, Mississippi, and now in St. Louis. What's happening on the ground there? At the same time, we're also looking more and more at deaths in custody. Why are people dying in prisons and jails? When somebody dies, is there some failure of the system that's leading to that? And what are the failures that are happening in response to that? And whether it's about notifying families or sort of changing practices to prevent the next death.
To piggyback on that, you know, at the end of April, there were some pretty substantial cuts to grants from the federal government to local jurisdictions that really impacted the way a myriad of different sort of local instances of criminal justice system functioned, and more significantly, how it was researched and how sort of promising practices in those spaces were propagated between communities. The federal government played a big role in that. There's been some great reporting about which grants were cut and the total number and some broad trends. Reuters has really been leading that. And sort of researchers like those at the Council for Criminal Justice have looked at that, and I'm really interested in sort of zooming in on places to see what may have been developing, but it can no longer happen because of those funding cuts. And I'm also really interested in sort of new crimes and how crimes that I think everyone agrees conceptually are not particularly serious can dominate the public discussion around public safety and criminal justice. So I'm really interested in how people who are unhoused experience the criminal justice system, and sort of the ways in which in the US we use the criminal justice system to try to respond to these large, complex social issues that aren't necessarily about public safety, like housing insecurity or poverty.
Thank you. And so if folks are interested, how can PyCon folks help?
I mean, I'll start by saying that I would just love if you are either a researcher or somebody within government whose work and whose data intersects with the kinds of things that we look at. I would just love to talk to you and learn more about your work, the tools and methods that you're using, the you know, the challenges that you see around gaining insights from that data, and to be honest, just knowing what data exists so I can file a public records request on the down low is always helpful. I think that if you're developing tools, I've already had some great conversations with people who are involved in producing some of the tools that we use, or at least I use on a daily basis to write Python code and operationalize it. And so if you want to shape those tools and those services towards relatively small shops that have interesting use cases, we'd love to talk to you. And I think that just engaging with the journalism. We are a nonprofit newsroom that doesn't have a paywall. We have a number of newsletters that can give you different size bites of really engaging stories about something that I think impacts in one way or another, we'll come in contact with.
And I'm just going to throw in their donations.
Yeah, we are a nonprofit newsroom. We are largely we are we don't have we don't charge a subscription. It is coming from sort of other foundation funders and people who support the journalism. So I think there's a lot of great work that's happening at this conference for folks that have made that ask, but it does take resources to keep the lights on and to continue to do the digging, whether it's in data or out on the streets, to shine a light on this system.
Awesome. And if somebody is inspired by what you're doing today and wants to do it themselves or do something like it, how might they do this or get involved?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways. If you're interested in sort of the data analysis side of things, and you want to start getting more into journalism, one approach could be that you find a data set that you're particularly keen on, and you could start blogging about your analysis. I mean, I've seen people sort of get attention from journalists to inspire stories or potentially work with as a freelancer with news organizations. There is a Slack group called News Nerdery that you'd all be welcome to join. We can connect you with that. That has data journalists from around the world talking about their craft, sharing ideas, helping troubleshoot bugs and the like. And I would also invite you all to join us for the NICAR conference that Elaine mentioned earlier. Thank you. Yes, Simon is there as well. Next year it's going to be in March in Indianapolis, and this is hundreds of the sort of leading data journalism practitioners from around the world. We all gather together and help each other sort of solve problems in journalism.
And I'll just add that I think there's a number of tools that are really popular, that are written in Python, that are really popular with data journalists, and I think they can always use bug fixes and documentation and features. And so if you are looking to apply your skills as a Python developer towards tooling that can fuel journalism that we talked about, making contributions to those projects is another great way.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So just a point of clarification, they mentioned NICAR. NICAR is the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, and earlier mentioned IRE, which is the investigative reporters and editors, two very related entities.
Yeah, they're connected.
Any final thoughts or words before we wrap up?
I'm just grateful to be here, and like I said, to learn so much from people who have different but often overlapping practices around using code to understand the world.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you for your very gracious welcome for us. We're thrilled to be here. And if anybody wants to talk about journalism and coding, we're going to be in an open space right after this, I think in 310 and 311. So please come talk with us.
And the QR code and short URL has links to the stories that we talked about during this talk, as well as some of the sort of community resources we mentioned.
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you all.